The moment I walked into that meeting and heard Paige presenting my 3-month innovation project as her own masterpiece, something inside me just broke. Not broke like crying broke, but broke like when you finally understand that someone you trusted has been slowly poisoning your life while smiling at you every single day. So as you can see, Paige was saying to our biggest client, Rodriguez, clicking through slides I had built pixel by pixel, this optimization framework I developed reduces processing time by 47% while maintaining quality standards. I developed. Those 2 words hit me like I'd been holding my breath underwater and finally came up gasping. 6 people around that table, my teammates, my manager, even the intern, all nodding like Paige was some kind of genius. And there I was, the actual creator, sitting there feeling completely invisible. But here's what made it so much worse. 3 days earlier, Ms. Rodriguez had personally called me. Not my manager, not Paige, but me. She'd gotten my direct number somehow and said, I wanted to thank you personally for the brilliant work on this optimization project. Your approach is exactly what we've been looking for. I'd been confused because I thought she meant the preliminary proposal I'd submitted weeks ago, but she kept talking about specific details that I'd only just finalized. Details that only existed in files on my personal work drive. Details that somehow Paige now knew word for word. So when Ms. Rodriguez suddenly interrupted Paige mid-presentation and said, Wait, that's not what you told me yesterday when we spoke, my whole world shifted. Paige's face went completely blank. I'm sorry, what? Yesterday afternoon, when you called me to discuss these exact metrics, Ms. Rodriguez continued, pulling out her phone. You said these weren't your calculations, that someone else on your team had developed the core framework. The room went dead quiet. I could hear the air conditioning humming, could hear someone's pen clicking, could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I think there might be some confusion, Paige stammered, but Ms. Rodriguez was already scrolling through her phone. Here it is, she said, reading directly from what must have been notes. You specifically said, and I quote, the genius behind this approach is actually our team member Zara. She's the one who cracked the processing bottleneck. My name is Zara, by the way. Before I dive deeper into this nightmare, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching. I promise this gets so much more twisted than you think. And please like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because what I'm about to tell you about my revenge is something I've never shared with anyone. And I need to know people are actually hearing this. So there I was, watching Paige's entire face crumble as she realized she'd been caught in a lie she didn't even remember telling. But here's the thing that made me feel sick. I never spoke to Ms. Rodriguez yesterday. I was in back-to-back meetings all day, which meant Paige had called her, pretending to be humble and giving me credit, probably to make herself look like a generous team player. Except she forgot she'd done it. Zara, Ms. Rodriguez turned to me with this warm smile. I have to say, when Paige called yesterday to make sure you got proper recognition, it really impressed me. Not many people in this industry are willing to highlight their teammates' contributions. I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for me to respond, and Paige was sitting there with this frozen smile that looked like it might crack her face in half. Thank you, I managed to say, my voice sounding weird and distant. I appreciate that. But inside, I was putting together a picture that made me feel absolutely sick. If Paige had called Ms. Rodriguez yesterday to give me credit, that meant she'd already planned to steal the presentation today. She'd called our client to make herself look magnanimous and team-oriented, then showed up today planning to present my work as her own anyway. That's not just stealing. That's calculated, sociopathic manipulation. The meeting ended with Ms. Rodriguez praising my innovative approach, while Paige sat there looking like she wanted to disappear. But as we filed out, I caught something in her expression that made my blood freeze. She wasn't embarrassed or ashamed. She was angry. At me, like somehow this was my fault. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every interaction I'd had with Paige over the past 2 years since she'd joined our team. How she always asked such thoughtful questions about my projects. How she'd volunteer to help with research. how she'd offered to review my presentations and give feedback. I'd thought she was being a good teammate, but now I was seeing it differently. I started going through my project files, and what I found made me physically nauseous. 3 major innovations I'd developed over the past 18 months, approaches that had gotten our team recognition, that had impressed leadership, that had even been featured in our company newsletter. All of them had Paige's name attached somewhere: co-developer, research contributor, strategic advisor. But I remembered working on these alone. I remembered the late nights, the breakthrough moments, the frustration and excitement of solving complex problems. Paige had just inserted herself into the story afterward. The worst part was how subtle it had been. She never claimed to be the sole creator. She'd just positioned herself as a key contributor, someone who'd helped shape the direction or provided crucial insights. And because she was so seemingly humble about it, because she always made sure to mention my involvement too, nobody questioned it. Except now I realized that to everyone else, we looked like a collaborative duo. Paige and Zara, the innovation team, equal partners. Which meant when it came time for promotions, for recognition, for opportunities, we'd be considered together. And since Paige was more outgoing, more politically savvy, better at managing up, I was watching someone build a career on my ideas while positioning herself as the more leadership-ready option. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I started paying attention, real attention, not just to my own work, but to how Paige interacted with everyone else on our team. And within a week, I discovered something that changed everything. It wasn't just me. Marcus from the analytics team mentioned how grateful he was that Paige had helped him refine his forecasting model, the same model he'd presented to leadership 6 months ago. Except when I pulled up the meeting notes, Paige hadn't even been in that presentation. But somehow, she'd gotten herself listed as a project advisor in the follow-up documentation. Nina from operations told me about this brilliant process improvement that she and Paige had developed together, even though I'd watched Nina work on that exact process for weeks without any input from Paige. But there was Paige's name on the final report, right next to Nina's. Rajesh from quality assurance mentioned Paige's invaluable feedback on a testing protocol that had revolutionized their workflow. But I'd been in the original brainstorming session where Rajesh had come up with that protocol entirely on his own. For 3 years, Paige had been systematically attaching her name to other people's innovations, not stealing them outright, just positioning herself as a contributor, making herself look like the common thread connecting all these brilliant ideas. And it was working. I heard through the grapevine that leadership was considering her for something big, something about a new mentorship program for high-potential newcomers, a role that would put her in charge of training the next generation of innovators in our industry. The irony made me want to scream. They were going to put someone who'd never had an original idea in her life in charge of developing original thinkers. But as I sat there that night, staring at the evidence I'd compiled, I realized something. Being angry wasn't going to fix this. Exposing her might stop her, but it wouldn't undo 3 years of stolen credit. It wouldn't get back the recognition, the opportunities, the career advancement that should have been mine and Marcus's and Nina's and Rajesh's. And honestly, I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. Paige had been so careful, so subtle. She'd never crossed the line into outright plagiarism. She'd just repositioned herself adjacent to brilliance until people started associating her with it. No, if I wanted real justice, I needed to be smarter than just tattling to HR. I needed to let Paige's ambition destroy her. See, here's what I figured out about Paige. Her whole strategy depended on other people not paying attention, on being forgettable enough that you wouldn't remember exactly who contributed what to which project, on people being too busy or too polite to question the narratives she carefully constructed. But what would happen if someone put her in a position where she actually had to prove she understood the work she'd been claiming credit for? The mentorship program she was being considered for? It wasn't just about managing people. It was about teaching cutting-edge methodologies to some of the brightest newcomers in our industry. People who would ask questions. People who would want to understand not just what to do, but why. People who would immediately recognize when someone was talking about concepts they'd memorized but never actually comprehended. So, instead of sabotaging her candidacy, I decided to accelerate it. I started subtly highlighting Paige's expertise in conversations with leadership, mentioned how impressed I was with her analytical approach, volunteered to write recommendation letters emphasizing her innovative problem-solving methodology and unique strategic insights. All techniques she'd stolen but never actually understood. The beautiful thing about Paige's ego was that she couldn't resist embracing the recognition. When I suggested she'd be perfect for the mentorship role, she practically glowed. When leadership started considering her seriously, she began preparing for the interviews, studying the methodologies she'd been claiming credit for like she was cramming for a test. But you can't cram 3 years of authentic expertise in a few weeks. I made sure she got the role. I even helped her prepare for the interviews, feeding her talking points about innovation frameworks and strategic thinking approaches, surface-level explanations that would sound impressive to managers but would crumble under real scrutiny. And then I made sure she got assigned the most analytically gifted newcomer in the program. His name was David, and he was terrifying in the best possible way. 24 years old, fresh from a top-tier graduate program, with this hungry intelligence that could spot logical inconsistencies from a mile away. The kind of person who didn't just want to know what to do, he wanted to understand the fundamental principles behind every decision. The kind of person who would ask why until he hit bedrock truth. I didn't have to sabotage anything. I just had to make sure David and Paige ended up in the same room, with Paige positioned as the expert and David positioned as the eager student. And then I waited for the laws of physics to take over. Because here's the thing about stolen knowledge. It doesn't have roots. It's just surface information floating around without the deep understanding that comes from actually developing ideas yourself. And when someone brilliant starts pulling on those threads, everything unravels. 3 weeks into the mentorship program, David started asking questions that Paige couldn't answer. Not complex questions, but basic ones. Why this approach instead of that one? What were the assumptions underlying this framework? How would you modify this methodology if the parameters changed? Questions that would be elementary for someone who'd actually developed these approaches. Questions that exposed Paige as someone who'd memorized conclusions without understanding the reasoning that led to them. I watched it happen in real time during team check-ins. David would ask about the logical foundation of some innovation technique, and Paige would give these vague, hand-wavy responses that sounded like she was reciting from a textbook she'd skimmed. Then David would politely press for clarification, and Paige would get flustered, then defensive, then angry. Other mentees started comparing notes. Sarah, Marcus's mentee, mentioned that her mentor could walk her through every decision point in his forecasting model, could explain exactly why each variable mattered and how changing one element would ripple through the entire system. Meanwhile, when David asked Paige similar questions about her optimization framework, she kept deflecting. "That's getting into very advanced territory," she'd say. "Let's focus on implementation for now." But David wasn't the type to be satisfied with implementation without understanding. And the more Paige avoided his questions, the more obvious it became that she couldn't answer them. The breaking point came during the monthly mentorship showcase, where each mentor was supposed to present alongside their mentee about breakthrough insights from their collaboration. David had prepared this brilliant analysis of optimization theory, building on the framework Paige was supposed to have developed. But when it came time for Paige to discuss the foundational principles he'd referenced, she just couldn't. She stood there, in front of the entire leadership team, trying to explain concepts she'd never actually understood, using terminology she'd memorized but couldn't define, referencing breakthrough moments that had never been hers. And David, this polite, earnest 24-year-old, kept trying to help her by asking clarifying questions that only made it more obvious that she had no idea what she was talking about. "Could you walk us through how you identified that processing bottleneck?" David asked, genuinely trying to support his mentor. Paige stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Because she'd never identified any processing bottleneck. I had. And I'd never explained to her how I'd figured it out because why would I? She'd just somehow gotten her name attached to the final result. The room was getting uncomfortable. People were shifting in their seats, exchanging glances. Even David was starting to look confused, like he couldn't understand why his brilliant mentor was struggling with such basic questions about her own work. And that's when I realized my revenge was complete. Not because I'd destroyed Paige's career, though I definitely had, but because I'd let her destroy it herself, using nothing but her own ambition and the unforgiving spotlight of having to prove competence she'd never possessed. She'd wanted to be seen as an innovator so badly that she'd put herself in a position where actual innovation was required. And when that moment came, when she had to demonstrate the expertise she'd been claiming for years, there was nothing there. Just memorized buzzwords and borrowed brilliance, crumbling under the weight of genuine inquiry from a mind sharp enough to recognize authentic knowledge. The most beautiful part was that nobody could blame me for anything. I'd recommended her for the role. I'd supported her candidacy. I'd even helped her prepare. All I'd done was create an environment where the truth mattered more than appearances. And the truth was that Paige had never been the innovator she'd pretended to be. After the showcase disaster, the room cleared out faster than I'd ever seen people leave a meeting. Nobody wanted to be associated with what had just happened. David looked absolutely mortified, like he'd accidentally humiliated his mentor in front of the entire company leadership. He kept apologizing to Paige, asking if he'd somehow misunderstood the assignment. That's what killed me the most. This brilliant kid was blaming himself for Paige's incompetence. But Paige wasn't sticking around to comfort her mentee. She grabbed her things and practically ran out of there, leaving David standing alone looking completely bewildered. I caught up with him in the hallway 20 minutes later. He was sitting on one of those uncomfortable lobby benches, staring at his laptop screen with this expression of pure confusion. "Hey," I said, sitting down next to him. "Rough presentation in there." He looked up at me with these tired eyes. "I don't understand what happened. All my research builds on Paige's optimization framework, but when I asked her to explain the core methodology, he trailed off, shaking his head. It was like she'd never seen it before." "What do you mean?" "I spent weeks studying her published work, preparing questions about her innovative approaches. But every time I tried to dive deeper into the reasoning behind her methods, she'd change the subject or give me these generic responses that didn't actually answer anything." My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice casual. "That's weird. What kind of questions were you asking?" David pulled up his notes. Basic stuff, really. Like, her optimization framework claims to reduce processing time through selective algorithmic prioritization. So I wanted to understand her decision matrix for determining priority levels. But she kept saying it was intuitive, and that I'd understand it better once I had more experience. He scrolled through more notes. Or when I asked about her quality maintenance protocols during the optimization process, she said I was overthinking it and should focus on broader implementation strategies instead. Every question he mentioned was something I could have answered in detail, because I'd developed every single aspect of that framework. I'd spent months figuring out those exact decision matrices, testing those quality protocols, refining the prioritization algorithms. Then today, David continued, when I presented my analysis building on her work, I thought she'd be excited to discuss the advanced applications. Instead, she looked completely lost. I wanted to tell him everything right then. This kid deserved to know that his mentor was a fraud, that his brilliant analysis was built on stolen foundations, that he hadn't done anything wrong. But I also knew that David was about to figure it out on his own, because people like David don't just accept inconsistencies, they investigate them. "Have you talked to anyone else about this?" I asked. "Actually, yeah. I mentioned it to some of the other mentees, and they're having similar experiences. Sarah said her mentor can explain every detail of his methodologies, can walk her through his entire thought process step by step. Same with the others." He closed his laptop and looked at me directly. "I think there might be something wrong with my mentorship assignment. Either Paige is having some kind of personal crisis that's affecting her ability to engage, or what? Or she doesn't actually understand the work she's supposed to be teaching me." There it was. David had arrived at the truth entirely on his own. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know. I don't want to get her in trouble, especially if she's going through something difficult." But I also can't learn from someone who can't answer basic questions about their own expertise. That's when I made a decision that I'm still not sure was entirely ethical, but felt absolutely necessary. David, I said, can I show you something? I pulled out my phone and opened the original project files for the optimization framework, the ones with timestamps showing months of development work, the ones with my name as the sole author, the ones with detailed notes explaining every decision David had been trying to understand. This is the original development documentation for the framework you've been studying, I said, handing him my phone. David's eyes went wide as he scrolled through the files. This is everything I've been trying to understand. All the reasoning behind the methodology, all the testing protocols, all the decision matrices. He looked up at me. But this has your name on it, not Paige's. I know. He scrolled some more, reading timestamps and development notes. You created this entire framework. Paige isn't mentioned anywhere in these files. I know. But she's been taking credit for it. She's built her entire mentorship curriculum around teaching methodologies you developed. I know. David sat there for a long moment, processing. Then he said something that absolutely floored me. How many other people has she done this to? Smart kid. He was already thinking bigger than just his own situation. Want to find out? I asked. What happened next was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. David started reaching out to other people whose work Paige had somehow gotten associated with. But he wasn't gossiping or trying to cause drama. He was conducting research, building a careful documentation of patterns. He talked to Marcus about the forecasting model Paige had supposedly helped develop. Marcus pulled up his original files and realized that Paige had never contributed anything substantial, but had somehow gotten herself listed as a project advisor in the final documentation. He connected with Nina about the process improvement that Paige had claimed to co-develop. Nina showed him her solo brainstorming notes, her individual testing phases, her personal breakthrough moments, none of which had involved Paige at all. He interviewed Rajesh about the testing protocol that Paige had supposedly provided invaluable feedback on. Rajesh walked him through his entire development process and couldn't identify a single moment where Paige had actually contributed anything meaningful. But here's what made David's investigation so devastating. He wasn't just documenting what Paige had stolen. He was documenting how she'd stolen it. The pattern was always the same. Someone would develop an innovation through weeks or months of solo work. They'd present it to the team or implement it successfully. Then, somehow, Paige would get herself associated with the project after the fact. Sometimes she'd volunteer to help with documentation and insert her name as a contributor. Sometimes she'd offer to present the work to leadership and position herself as a co-developer. Sometimes she'd just start referencing the innovation in conversations as something we had worked on until people forgot who the actual we was. And because she was so strategic about it, never claiming to be the sole creator, always acknowledging others' involvement, nobody had noticed that she was systematically building a reputation on everyone else's achievements. David compiled everything into what he called a pattern analysis. Not an accusation, not a complaint, just a factual documentation of inconsistencies between Paige's claimed expertise and the actual development history of the innovations she'd been associated with. He scheduled a meeting with the mentorship program director. I wasn't in that meeting, but I heard about it afterward. David presented his analysis with the same methodical precision he'd brought to studying the optimization framework. He showed the original development documentation, the timeline inconsistencies, the pattern of post-facto association. He wasn't trying to destroy Paige. He was trying to solve a problem that was preventing him from getting the mentorship he needed. But the director wasn't stupid. She immediately understood the implications of what David was showing her. Within 48 hours, HR had launched a quiet investigation. And that's when everything really started unraveling for Paige. Because once people started looking closely at her track record, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 3 years of attaching herself to other people's innovations. 3 years of building expertise she'd never actually developed. 3 years of positioning herself for opportunities based on achievements that weren't hers. The mentorship program was suspended pending the investigation. David and the other mentees were reassigned to different mentors. actual experts who could answer their questions and guide their development. Paige was placed on administrative leave while HR reviewed her employment history. But here's the thing that made this revenge perfect. I never had to be the villain. I never had to expose her or make accusations or destroy her reputation myself. All I had to do was create a situation where the truth mattered, where competence couldn't be faked, where stolen expertise would inevitably be revealed as hollow. David's investigation wasn't motivated by malice. It was motivated by a genuine desire to learn from someone who actually understood the work they were teaching. When he couldn't get that from Paige, he went looking for answers. And the answers led him, step by step, to the truth. The really beautiful part was watching how this affected everyone else whose work Paige had appropriated. Marcus, Nina, Rajesh. They all started getting recognition for innovations they'd actually developed. Leadership began to understand who the real contributors were, who the genuine problem solvers and creative thinkers had been all along. Meanwhile, Paige's carefully constructed reputation crumbled, not because I attacked it, but because it had never been built on solid ground. When people started asking her to demonstrate the expertise she'd been claiming, there was nothing there to demonstrate. The investigation concluded that while Paige hadn't technically committed plagiarism, she'd never claimed sole credit for anything. She had engaged in a pattern of misleading representation of contributions that called into question her fitness for roles requiring demonstrated expertise. She was terminated 3 weeks later. But you know what the most satisfying part was? It wasn't watching her lose her job. It wasn't even watching her reputation collapse. It was watching David thrive under a real mentor, someone who could answer his questions, who could explain the reasoning behind every methodology, who could guide him toward developing his own innovative approaches. David ended up revolutionizing our entire optimization framework within 6 months, not because he was trying to show off, but because he was genuinely curious about pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And when he presented his breakthrough to leadership, he made sure to acknowledge everyone who'd contributed to his development, including me, for creating the foundational framework he'd built upon. That's when I realized the revenge was complete, not just because Paige was gone, but because the system had been corrected. Real innovators were getting real recognition. Genuine expertise was being valued over political manipulation. The next generation of talent was being mentored by people who actually knew what they were talking about. Sometimes I think about whether I could have handled this differently, whether I should have just reported Paige to HR immediately instead of orchestrating this elaborate exposure. But honestly, I don't think a simple HR complaint would have been enough. Paige was too careful, too strategic. She would have explained away the inconsistencies, repositioned herself as a collaborative team player, maybe even found a way to make me look petty and vindictive. The only way to truly stop someone who builds their career on stolen brilliance is to put them in a position where authentic brilliance is required. And that's exactly what happened. Paige wanted to be recognized as an expert so badly that she accepted a role requiring her to demonstrate expertise she'd never possessed. And when that moment of truth came, when she had to prove she understood the innovations she'd been claiming credit for, the fraud became undeniable. The mentorship program relaunched 6 months later with much stricter vetting processes for expertise verification. David became one of their success stories, eventually developing methodologies that revolutionized how our entire industry approaches optimization challenges. And me? I got the recognition I should have had all along, not just for the original framework, but for my actual expertise, my genuine problem-solving abilities, my real contributions to innovation. It turns out that when you stop letting credit thieves position themselves adjacent to your brilliance, people start recognizing where that brilliance actually comes from. Looking back, I realized this experience taught me something crucial about justice. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't about destroying someone. It's about creating conditions where truth can't be hidden, where competence can't be faked, where stolen achievements inevitably reveal themselves as hollow. Paige destroyed herself. I just made sure she had the opportunity to do it spectacularly. If you've made it this far in my story, I need you to know something. This isn't just about one dishonest coworker getting exposed. This is about what happens when we stop accepting that credit thieves deserve the benefit of the doubt, when we start insisting that expertise means more than just knowing the right buzzwords. Please like this video if my story resonated with you, because I need to know that people understand why I had to handle it this way. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about what happens when justice finally catches up with people who think they're too clever to get caught. And hit that bell because I promise you, this is just the beginning of what I've learned about fighting back against workplace manipulation. Your comments mean everything to me. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever dealt with someone like Paige. Tell me what you think about the choice I made. Because sharing this story has been terrifying and liberating, and I need to know it was worth it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for believing that people like David, genuine, curious, brilliant people, deserve mentors who actually know what they're talking about. Sometimes the best revenge is just making sure the truth has room to breathe.